Thank you very much for inviting me in this conference, and I'm very glad to tell here something about a part of a project I'm leading as a project leader in Amsterdam. It's an international project for, let's say, some four years almost, with at about 10 universities or 15 universities, a little bit dynamic group. And work we're doing is really quite, well, it goes from museography to narratives, and for very specific places we visit with field trips and so on. We organize a lot of conferences, and we have publishing series, and we also started now a new journal. So I'm just going to give you a sort of, let's say, a lecture on the narrative aspects of a lot of things which we have already seen here in this conference, which I found very fascinating. And I must say it's impressive to hear all these different stories from all parts of, especially Eastern Europe and Central Europe, of course. Well, to start with, in the same sort of direction, in the Propetovisk, the Jewish Menorah Center, Jewish New Memorial Center, is it's an interesting case in Ukraine, which we already talked a lot about. And it's a sort of combined Jewish business center. It's just open with 7 towers, which of course explains the name Menorah. But it's also the first Holocaust museum in Ukraine at the moment, which is quite interesting because it's in fact a private museum owned by Igor Kolomoisky, which is the tycoon, as we all know, for this, the Propetovisk, it's difficult to pronounce, Oblast. He's the governor, and he's also a fierce supporter of the Kiev regime, the new Kiev regime. So it's interesting there that you see, we have here, there are not many Jews left in Ukraine, but this is a Jew who born in the city, in fact, went to Geneva, became also Israeli citizen, and now returned after during this situation, after the Orange Revolution already, and became a fierce political supporter, which also has to do, I must say, with a sort of business war going on between him and Putin in particular. During the last month, he, after the Crimean, let's say, annexation of Russia, his private bank, he's owner of a private bank, which is an extremely large group of banks in Ukraine, but also in some other countries like Swiss, was annexed and Crimean by Putin, and immediately he started to nationalize Putin's titanium factory in Dnipropetrovsk. So basically, you see there's going on a sort of economic business war between these two great magnates and with political power and so on. But interestingly, this is probably the first Jew really supporting the new Ukrainian regime, and we'll discuss that later, why that is remarkable. For him, as for other Jews, there is a small Jewish community, in particular Shimon Kamiensky, who supports also the regime. For them, Ukraine is a sort of new Israel in a certain way. And you see, after the Orange Revolution, what you see is a sort of rebirthing, a newborn nation, in which the Maidan revolt is even compared to the 1967 Israeli Jordanian Arab War. So there is a remarkable, let's say, reframing of narratives going on at the moment there. And this is remarkable in many ways, and I don't know how to value this, but it's important to notice. So for them, you could say the Ukrainian situation is comparable to Israel in the sense that Krim is Gaza. It's really quite naive, but it's the way it works. And Russians, of course, then are the Arabs in this picture. Well, of course, that's not everywhere the same sort of narratives. As we all know, in the eastern part, in Donetsk region, the center of the counter-revolt, the situation is completely opposite. And there, most people, at least most leaders, support Putin's argument, which of course says that the illegal putschist Kiev regime nowadays represents a return to Nazi occupation during the 1940s Great Patriotic War. So you have this really opposing narratives which both use the experiments of the Second World War, the Holodomor, the Holocaust in particular, And this feeds it in a certain way. So you have not just only a political situation and an economical struggle, but there is an ideological legitimation behind it, strongly connected to this sort of capitalist feudalism there, with its large tycoons and immense powers, and powers also to, let's say, to work through the media and as we see also by use of museums. And this is an important aspect because what you see, and also of course in the whole way we deal with this forces of the right, there is a sort of militant nationalist creed behind it and connected to it, also in Donetsk, of course, in the pro-Russia side. And it had a lot to do with emotions and feelings about history going to repeat itself. And so what you could say, that is that we are dealing here in the bordering zone of Europe at this very moment with a situation which in my view is almost comparable as the Balkan Yugoslav war of the 1990s. It's really a crisis moment which goes much further than just only an internal crisis related to state building, but it has a geopolitical dimension which is really important to address. And there is also a sort of fatality in the whole series of events as a sort of no return after February 21, the massacre, when things really changed, not only the regime, but also the geopolitical situation, in the sense that the United States became involved in it and Europe suddenly had to take a stand. And for us, it's almost impossible to understand the Ukrainian situation, as it is very difficult to understand the Russian position at the moment. So we are witnessing a very insecure situation. And I think it's important to realize also that this is quite new in relation to what only happened some 15 years ago in let's say, in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. In 2000, we all witnessed the Stockholm Declaration of the International Forum on the Holocaust. 44 world leaders in Stockholm decided that something like the Shoah should never happen again, as it was said. It should be forever seared in our collective memory, while new genocides should be prevented by research, education, and remembrance, to plant the seeds of a better future amidst the soil of a bitter past. Well, this is a very important direction, policy, you could say, which has been taken over by the European Union for the last decades, and which means that we have seen in almost all European countries, also after 2005 United Nations resolution, Holocaust Memorial Days on the 27th of January, which is, by the way, the day of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Russians, which is an important aspect not to forget, when talking about this Eastern European situation nowadays. And Holocaust museums have been very important, and of course education program and a lot of money for doing research and so on and so on. And so you could say there has, what's happened is that the sort of Holocaust paradigm has become very influential, not only in historical research, and not only in terms of the Holocaust memory booms, but also in terms of European policy. Well, that could be seen as a sort of ending, in a way, of the European project, which, of course, the shock of Srebrenica in 1995 suddenly made everybody aware that genocides could really happen again in Europe, although not in the European Union, but then in the bordering zones. So you could see the whole enlargement of Europe after that could be seen as a sort of answer to the insecure situation after the fall of the wall and the ending of the Cold War. And then the Holocaust became, of the Stockholm Declaration, and because of this European policy, a sort of entry ticket for new member states to become members of the European Union. And what you see now is that we are going into a difficult situation. In first instance, you could say this, the Inappropriative Museum, this Holocaust Museum, as we see here, is still something related to the Holocaust paradigm, in the sense that you could say it shows that Ukraine is now really part of the Western world. But on the other hand, we can notice today that that's related not so much to the fear of of racism to appear again, in the sense of anti-Nazism, but it's related to anti-Russian coalitions in the sense of, let's say, the opposite of the original Stockholm Declaration. So we may ask, are we still living in the shadow of Auschwitz? Is the EU's and ITF's mission of Holocaust education, remembrance, and research not strongly politically, ethically, and biased? And what could be said about the use, misuse, and abuse of the Holocaust or Auschwitz paradigm by present-day politicians and memory makers, which we see at the moment in Ukraine, but we see it everywhere, of course, also in the United States, in Israel, in the Middle Eastern conflict, and so on. And is the Holocaust paradigm really all-embracing, is it universal and global, or should it be understood as an authoritative, dominant Western narrative, competing with other experiences in different parts of Europe during what has been called by Eric Hobsbawm the Age of Extremes, 1914, 1991, or as Sigmund Bauman would have called it, the Century of the Camps. Well, we are definitely not living in that anymore. We're living in the century of the media, of post-memory, but we have to deal for ourselves with this 20th century experience in Europe. Well, let me turn to another situation. This is Croatia, the Jasenovac Memorial Museum, where for a very long time already in former Yugoslavia, this was, let's say, in Tito's period, this was the Auschwitz of the Balkans. It was a place where, according to communists at that moment, something like 1 million people should have died, among them mostly Serbs and Jews. And the killers were Ustasha, not specifically Germans, but Ustasha. And it's like the satellite situation Per already told about in the Balkans. This was a satellite state of Nazi Germany. So Yugoslavia had to cope with this fact that one of his, let's say, its population had fought terrible wars during the Second World War, and which means that under Tito, history had to be put in the freezer. And this is expressed more or less in this, what I think quite beautiful sculpture made by Bogdan Bogdanovic, the Yugoslav architect who made a lot of this sort of memorial sites in Yugoslavia. It's from the 1980s, and it expressed the lotus flower, which means hope and conciliation at places like this, as painful heritage. And this contrast to the situation nowadays, which is quite different. Here you see Jasenovac at the left, and Donja Gradina at the right side, which is basically the same camp during the Second World War. It was all Jasenovac, but has now different names because it's part of different former Yugoslav states. So Jasenovac is Croatian at the moment. Donja Gradina is part of Republika Srpska, which is itself part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it's a Serbian part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what you see now is that in the Croatian Museum, which has become part of Croatia in 2002, since a few years it's reopened, not with a great collection, but the former collection is more or less stolen. I will say something about that after this. But it's basically now a sort of modern Holocaust museum in which the staff is working on documenting registered deaths, and they now say that something like 80 to 100,000 people should have died at Jasenovac, which is a completely different number, of course, than 1 million, but it's also much more than in the Tutsman period when the government thought that only 10,000 people should have been died at Jasenovac. And on the other side, you see the Serbian situation. Well, you see here this billboard with 700,000, which is not a million anymore, but 700,000 is quite a different number than, let's say, 80,000. So the Serbs are still dealing with this number war and have this great large number of the communist period. Well, the Croats have lowering down, so you see this whole number war going on here in a very interesting situation. It's, let's say, only 2 kilometers from each other, but you have to go from one nation to another and to cross a river, the Sava River. And then you see this competing memories and competing narratives work out. Well, interestingly, this guide also in Donja Gradina was a very nice guy, and when we came there with a field trip with our group. This was also the first moment when the staff was meeting each other, and from then on, they're now on speaking terms. And they said, well, we hold on our figures, but on the other hand, figures are not that important anymore. So there will be probably a sort of new coming out of this. It's quite interesting to see how it works. But this was basically one of the reasons why the museum, nowadays the Jasenovec Museum, has changed its staging and its narrative. Because this is, it's after Tito's death, situation changed. And this was in 1986 to 1989, a traveling exhibition, but it's created by the Jasenovec team, which shows for the very first time photographs of the Ustasha killing in Jasenovac, which was a terrible sort of killing, not with gas chambers and not even with guns, but with these knives, these Ustasha knives and so on. So you see a very brutal way of killing with these people in Ustasha uniforms there, and a lot of dead bodies, which means basically Serbian dead bodies. And this was a reason why this traveling exhibition was very popular in Serbian military troops. So you saw most of the places where this exhibition was seen was also a place with Serbian soldiers. You also have, of course, Croatian military centers, but there it was not very popular at all. Well, basically, this is an interesting aspect of this is that in the 45,000 documents in the Hague trials on Yugoslavia, many of the perpetrators in trial there, also Milosevic, told in their witnesses that in the testimonies that this exhibition was something that triggered them, because they had the emotion when they saw this. If they did that to us, then we should do something like that to them. So you see here, as Natasha Jovicic, the director of Jasenovac, is also believing very strongly that but by making a museum, a narrative like this, by showing this sort of very explicit photos, that you evoke hatred in a certain way and create new conflicts. Of course, this is a question which we have to ask ourselves, it's true or not true, because basically this is the same technique the Allied forces used in Germany directly after the war to let the Germans open their eyes, which is exactly, of course, the word used here, the opening the eyes. And so you see a technique which was very successful in former Nazi Germany and which has led to the end, to quite peaceful outcome, worked completely in the other way in former Yugoslavia. And well, this is the situation today. You see now a very ITF-like Western type of museum showing individual personal belongings, archaeological research and so on, and very personal stories. So the idea is now that people should identify with living persons, that you can look in the eyes, give them a name by photos, family stories and so on. This is basically what we do in a lot of Western Holocaust museums, also in Auschwitz, US Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. But strangely, it doesn't work in Croatia. Croatian people don't visit the museum at all, because they still say, well, why should we go to a museum? We only hear stories about dead Serbs. I mean, not to speak about dead Jews. So, in fact, they have a very good museum now, but the museum is not very popular. And they had a very, let's say, a museum in the 1980s, which was very popular among the Serbs, but then had a fatal outcome. So these are questions we have to ask in museum business. How are we dealing with this situation? Because normally we always assume that we live in a country where there is no conflict. But the fact is, of course, that in most European countries today, I mean the 28 countries are not the 15 of before 2005. We're now dealing with a lot of former communist countries which have a lot of conflict to deal with. And of course also Southern European countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal and so on. So I think this competing memories which we see here is something we really have to address. We have to ask ourselves how to present trauma, in a sense, in a museum context. Well, going from there, this is our field trip which we had to some other places. This is Kozara Memorial Park, is also in Srpska. Here we have a team with a lot of people from different countries, and especially Americans in our team were very upset when they saw this exhibition, which is basically the same as Jasenovac in the 1980s. It's still there in the Serbian part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I found it very fascinating because it gave me a sort of time machine experience. So I thought, yes, so it must have been at that time in Jasenovac. But if you see these terrible photos of young children, it's completely politically incorrect today. Although we all know, of course, that this was the way in the 1950s, 1960s. Many museums showed photos of the Holocaust. So even we are sometimes, as a team, in a lot of internal conflicting discussions, you could say, about how to deal with it, but especially how to deal with museum staff. We had an extreme debate there with the people working there. And it was not very nice because some of the people were really, let's say, offending them in the sense that what you do is terrible and you should not be allowed to show these sort of things, it's unethical and so on. So it's very difficult even for intellectuals to try to understand the narrative of the other, because that's basically what we always are doing in this situation. Well, I would not go into this. This brings us into aspects of, let's say, the way we use narratives like the Holodomor, and Per already told about that. The Ukrainian situation today, in which the Holocaust fits as is a sort of used as a sort of model, you could say, especially the politicians, for what's being called the Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide, which is basically a hunger terror with the Russians in the role of perpetrators. This is a very complex situation, which has to do with a sort of narrative which is basically about national birthrights and rebirthing. Of course, also the Holocaust can be used in this way, as happened in Israel, or happens in Israel today. And we also have other variances of this in Poland, for example, with the sort of Polonization, which follows more or less the model as what you see here, the Aussiedlung by the Germans, the Germanization of Poland. So this is one aspect of what we all see in Eastern Europe today. The outcome is, of course, that we don't see there these multicultural countries, but now more or less homogenization. But this is another aspect I want to go on for a little bit. This is, let's say, the Western way of dealing with the Holocaust, which has a lot to do with the notion of absence, the notion of loss. This is Daniel Mendelbaum, who has written a novel which is, it's also named The Loss, Mendelssohn, sorry. Daniel Mendelssohn is an American writer, author. He's a classical scholar from Princeton University, and he wrote a sort of queue, you could say, a sort of quest of finding his traces of his family back in former Poland, Galicia, now Ukraine, which means that he had to go with his sister and his brother to Bolokov, and in search for stories, lost stories of their families, basically because his grandfather died and they found pictures in his jacket, which he, for his whole life he kept there. And so they came to know that the names of relatives, and they want to know if anybody in Bolokov knew something about them. Well, Bolokov was a Jewish shtetl, and the strange thing is that nobody living there now knew anything about the Jews, not even knowing that there were Jews in Bolokov, except for the fact that there is still a sort of ruined cemetery and a ruin of a synagogue and so on. So the traces are there, but as Mendelssohn wrote himself, we arrived at that place, a place where nothing could be found, and certainly not the people we searched for. So in searching for his roots, you could say, he found in the eastern landscapes of the dead, let's say the landscapes without Jews, he found only a heritage of laws, or as he put it, the stories don't fit into reality anymore. And this is a very basic thing which you find in a lot of Holocaust museums also. Let's say the Anne Frank House, you already mentioned it in Amsterdam, already in the early 1960s, invented more or less, Otto Frank himself, the notion of absence by wanting to show a house in which everything was lost in the same way as he found it back when he came from Auschwitz, came back in Amsterdam to his place of hiding, which was basically also his factory, and nothing was left, not his family, everyone was dead, he knew that already, but also every personal belongings, all sorts of, well, everything which has been there was gone. And he said, I wanted to keep it this way. This is the way I want to show it, as an empty house. It was not meant to be a museum, I must say that. It became only so in the 1960s, 1970s. But when it became a museum, it became extremely important and influential. And with it, this notion of absence became a part of Holocaust narratives, which you find now everywhere, in movies, in novels, like in documentaries like those of Daniel Mendelssohn, and also this website, which is the website of his brother. Delphine already talked about this Jewish Gen website. Well, this is a sort of website you find also of people searching for their roots personally in Poland or in Ukraine or Belarus. And well, they put a lot of photos on it of the situation now and the situation before, the family photos and so on. There's also, of course, an element in it of Shoah, of Claude Lanzmann, which used this same sort of narrative of the Mémoire, of a landscape, a guilty landscape in a certain way, which conceals something. And we know what it conceals, but we don't know exactly what it conceals. So this metaphor is extremely strong. And that confronts us with a different situation, which has been called now by Pierre Dubois, Father Dubois, the Holocaust by bullets, and a lot of others have taken over this term, which is also to do again with Ukraine and Belarus and Poland. The other Holocaust, not in the camps, not in Auschwitz, not the Auschwitz model, but the killing of people in steddles. Of course, we know already by trials and so on a lot of that about it. And basically, this is a sort of very, well, let's say, very strange kind of expeditions from Western Europe to Ukraine to let people talk about what had happened in villages. But you could say it is remarkable that that Holocaust narrative was for a very long time focused on camps, on the century of the camps, and on Auschwitz in particular as a sort of iconic aspect of the Holocaust, while most people not died in camps, not even in ghettos, but simply in villages, in steddles. And of course, the most terrible situation at the time was was the experience of Babi Jar, known already, of course, by German trials in the 1960s and later. And we have some, well, we have quite some information about Babi Jar, also witnesses, but strangely, it has not become very iconic in Holocaust narrative. So the Dutch historian Hans Blom, who was also the director of NIOD, which is the Dutch Research Institute of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Yeah. He asked the question in his Leiden-Clever lecture, why Babi Jar has not become like Auschwitz, a sort of icon of the Holocaust. And his answer was there were no survivors, because we know a lot about Auschwitz, because those extreme lot of survivor stories, the Spielberg project and so on, and all these published witness stories, and of course very influential books and films and so on. And Robert Jan van Pelt, who is the, let's say, the Auschwitz historian in a certain way, he even added that it has a lot to do with the fact that Babi Jar is not framed into a sort of narrative, or nor any of these places of the Holocaust by bullets. They lack stories, as he said. They lack the power of the narrative. And this is the thing, I think, to conclude that, in my view, it's not only that, because we know a lot about Babi Jar, and there has been written also stories, and there are witness stories also on Babi Jar. But of course, it's interesting to notice that we think it's important to debate the Holocaust when we have a sort of aesthetical or literary narrative way to deal with it. It says something about the way our memory works, and this should warn us in a certain way, because we are dealing with a situation which is unbelievably complex and will even become more and more complex as much as we learn more from other countries in Europe, and we become more and more transnational space, a transnational space in Europe which also become more and more digitized. So we learn more from each other's stories by oral histories, interviews, but also by archive sources, which now are all available on the internet, and if they aren't, they will become within the next decades. But I think what is very important, and which we have to deal with is in the Eastern Europe experience, is that we have to deal, let's say, with a situation which is completely different than Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was very important for Western Europe and for many Jews who ended up in Israel or the United States or in Western European countries. But in Eastern Europe, the situation is still there. People live in the situation where people were killed, which is a completely different aspect to deal with. And it means that that we are, we are dealing also with a very complex situation in which, let's say, there are too much places in a certain way, too much sites of painful heritage, too much sites with changed names, people with lost stories, people migrated to different countries, diasporic memories. So it's extremely complex. And we have to find an answer in Europe to deal with that. So I think there are more or less three scenarios which we can expect. One is which we are dealing with already, is you could call it a sort of memory wars, which you find everywhere, local wars. This is in Estonia, the bronze soldier in Stettin, which was the war memorial monument in the capital, and nowadays after 1991 was regarded as a pro-Russian memorial. And what you see is a sort of counter memorial nowadays. It's not because of protest of the European Union and the United States and Israel. It's not put on in the capital, but the bronze soldier is removed from the capital, and now you have a sort of counter monument. And if you look, well, you see it's a German soldier, although it's of course an Estonian soldier, he's a freedom fighter, but with a German Stahlhelm and a Mauser gun. These were basically the troops who killed the Jews. So we are dealing now with a part of Europe in which, let's say, the Holocaust perpetrators are being seen as national heroes. And, well, this is one aspect we have to deal with. How are we understand that? What does it mean? The other thing, of course, is the problem of national heroes. Per already discussed Bandera. You see here a stamp, Ukrainian stamp with Bandera after the Orange Revolution. We also have these massacres, of course. The massacre was then in Poland, now Ukraine, which gives us a very complex situation of shifting borders also. And of course, we have also to deal with fallen heroes, not only with new heroes, but also people who were heroes during the communist period, like in Lithuania, where the War Crime Investigation Committee at the moment has accused Rachel Markolis and Vanya Brantsovsky, which were, well, very old, still living. I think they are still living, I don't know exactly for this moment now. Accused of organizing a massacre among Lithuanian people. About 38 people died without saying that these people were, in fact, what they were doing was ordering punishment expedition against nationalists collaborating with the Germans in the killing of 3,500 Jews. So we are dealing in a very strange sort of debate. Well, to end up, the last sort of strategy we have to deal with, we already discussed that, is this new situation of the occupation museum, genocide museums, terror museums everywhere in Eastern Europe, which are there are much more of them, of these than that single Holocaust museum nowadays in Ukraine. And what they address, of course, is the terror done, is Soviet terror to Eastern former communist populations. And this is not only a local or a national situation anymore, this is also addressed at the level of the European Union. In 2008 we had the Prague Declaration as a sort of answer to the Stockholm Declaration, which says that communist terror should be treated in the same way as Nazi terror, and also by way of a sort of Nuremberg trial. And 2009, only 1 year later, this was already taken over by the European Parliament, which means it's now, we all have to do this in a certain way because it's now European policy. I will finish with that. So basically, this is the situation which we are dealing with, a very complex Europe, I guess, at the local level, at the national level, at the European level. And well, I think this is the world we have to acknowledge. And so it's very good in that sense also to debate that here in this sort of meetings. And well, thank you for your attention.